Welcome everybody. My name is Bill Cope and we're very pleased to have you with us in this recording of an update of the MOOC that Jim Anderson made, that Professor Anderson made a number of, 3 years ago now, more than 3 years ago, for Coursera. And because so much has happened in the world, many things that have happened have been distressing and problematic, we thought it was time to come back and talk about the issues that were first brought up in that MOOC. So this is Mary Kalantzis, who's with me, and we have here as people who can join this discussion and begin the conversation with Professor Anderson, Professor Bill Trent, Professor Yoon Pak, and Professor Chris Span, who's joining us from his phone. So I'm going to hand over first to Professor Trent to begin the conversation with Professor Anderson.
Well, first, thank you for arranging this. I'm novice to the world of MOOC and online instruction myself, but I remember when Professor Anderson, when Jim began his work in it, and I was impressed with the way he as a historian took to this format, this arena for delivery of discussions and thinking about critical issues like the racism that he and I grew up in. Jim and I happen to have the benefit of being Southerners. And so I've actually been anxious to talk to Jim about the kinds of changes we are witnessing that make, at least cause me to reflect so much on the changes that I'm seeing in the capital of the Confederacy, Richmond, Virginia, my hometown. We just took down the statue of Robert E. Lee, and Monument Avenue, all of the Confederate generals. So there's one statue on Monument Avenue now, and that's the statue of Arthur Ashe. And I would appreciate having Jim's response to what he thinks, what he feels that communicates to the generations behind us. Jim and I have these markers. We grew up with the color-only signs over the water fountains, bathrooms, and the restrictions about the places where we could go. So I would appreciate having his take on what he thinks the takeaway for young people growing up in this environment, in contrast to what we grew up under, what that means for their quality of life.
As historians, we have a saying that each generation writes its own history. Mm-hmm. And we are actually witnessing a new generation writing its own history. It doesn't mean that they somehow extreme revisionist. It means that they are available to different questions and different kinds of evidence that compel them to reframe and to rethink things that are conventional or consensus history. And so what we're seeing now with this monument question is a reflection on things that we have accepted. It's not just about the Confederacy. It's also about Woodrow Wilson. It's about Theodore Roosevelt. It's about George Washington. It's about Columbus. And this is the first generation to really reflect critically on this. We kind of live with those things. We worried and resented the Confederate statues, but we didn't think that much about George Washington or Thomas Jefferson or Woodrow Wilson. This generation is thinking anew about the meaning of racism, and they're looking at all of our historical figures and where they stood on this question of racism and of race prejudice, on slavery, on settler colonialism. And so this is going to be an ongoing contest, an ongoing battle. I think some people are advising caution. It's like, don't throw George Washington out with Robert E. Lee. But I think, you have to trust this generation to make its own assessment and to think about. And I think one of the things that where prior generations have failed, and particularly in education, is that there is at least a slither of an anti-racist tradition in American history. And you can see it in individuals, you can see it in lawmaking, you can see it in politics. I mean, when we think about Charles Sumner in the Boston School, the segregation case in the 19th century, where he stood for equal opportunity for education and stood against segregation and racism in education, But that's a long history, even though it's a smaller component of the wider history. And we have not taught a lot of our young people about this history of anti-racism in American history. So they don't have that particular identity. The only one they have is vis-a-vis the racist tradition that's established and exists in monuments and so forth. And so I kind of feel uplifted by the way they're looking at things. They're not accepting things as we did. They're raising questions while we did not raise questions. And they're quite adamant about making changes. I do think that every movement has to be careful to make sure it's not hijacked by someone who does not have good intention and simply want to simply raise noise as opposed to making productive and meaningful change.
It's interesting the way you characterize that. I used to use a notion that I grew up as a renter, and that I didn't have a particular kind of relationship to material property, and that renter mindset, the things that I could rearrange physically and so forth, even though I was nominally the owner of such. I think one of the things that's intriguing to me is the extent to which the cohorts coming behind us are growing up, in a sense, with a much different orientation towards the material life that they are going to experience. They have much more of a sense of being, the possibility of being owners and being able to actually manage and own their lives in a way in which, at least from my experiences and from many social sciences, those are aspects of control and actual personal orientation that was different for my cohort, for our cohort.
So moving over to you and Professor Pak, your perspectives from the work that you do around ethnicity and racism in the American context. What do you make of this moment?
Right, thank you. And thank you to Professors Cope and Kalantzis for getting this together. In all honesty, there is that sense of hope that I do have, because our younger generation, how we call them the Gen Z, and I'm living with them right now, they're really pushing me beyond the boundaries of how to think and how to call things out for what they are. The other part, though, that I'm really also wrestling with this moment, because there's a part of me as a person, but also as a scholar, there's a sense in which we have the history, we know it. There's no way in which we can't get that information off the internet. But at the same time, why have we made it so difficult to make these structural changes? I ask that in a rhetorical way, but not in a rhetorical way. And this is where I'd like to get Professor Anderson's feedback, and perhaps the others, in terms of, we've built these systems deliberately, and I talk about it in the realm of public schooling and education. We know that we've done this deliberately to keep people separate from each other, but also to ensure that there are groups of kids who don't do as well as others. Yet there are always these piecemeal and additive approaches to how we can begin to restructure, or is it restructure? And in a way that is different now, so that these calls for diversity in our teaching, the teacher workforce, doesn't continue to remain 80% white female middle class for the next 100 years, because that's been a stable statistic over the last 100 years. The disproportionate rates of school discipline. So my question that I continue to have as we continue to work on this process of building a multiracial democracy, and as it's reflected in our school system, I want to get Professor Anderson's perspective on what can we do deliberately now to address the structural inequities in our school systems, and at least to build in teacher diversity and the workforce, also builds upon anti-racist efforts.
Okay, first I missed part of the question because your voice was breaking up. So if you could succinctly kind of restate the question.
That's kind of difficult. So in this moment, as we're continuing to build a multiracial democracy, how within our school systems do we deliberately structure in teacher diversity that also builds in anti-racist efforts into that?
Well, I think within education, as with other dominant institutions, whether it's health or the wealth gap or employment, those things really are structural changes that to dismantle them will take a massive effort, as well as cost. One of the things I do recall from the Martin Luther King movement, the last thing that he did when he was assassinated, he was headed to Washington for a Poor People's Campaign. And I remember being a bit surprised when he said that the other things he had accomplished, like the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, removal of colored white water signs and other kinds of sort of symbolic and discriminatory practice. He said that was easy. Mm-hmm. He said, and I thought, wow, that wasn't really easy. But he said that the Poor People's Campaign was going to be much more difficult because this time he was asking for a check, asking for the resources that it would take to dismantle structural and institutional forms of racism. And I think that's the thing where people draw the line today, is that when something is one too many zeros attached to the cost that it takes to change something, they want to put a Band-Aid on it and live with it. But if we're going to change the wealth gap, if we're going to change segregated schooling, or we're going to diversify our teaching force, get back to your question, just a mere question of affordability. Most of the people, Latinx, African-American, Native American students who would want to go into education or in any profession or occupation can't afford to go to the state at this point. So we're struggling with affordability. In order to make it possible, at first when Bernie Sanders said free college education, people kind of said, oh, we can't afford that. We're going to have something akin to free college education, much as we've seen in other parts of the world, in order to dismantle the kind of structural racism and segregation that we have in education. We're also going to have an anti-racist component to our education as well, so that everybody involved, from teachers to administrators to college professors, what it takes to deal with systemic racism. And it's interesting because I remember as an undergraduate student listening to Stokely Carmichael and the late Kwame Ture talk about institutional racism. That's where the concept was born within the movement. And he was lecturing to us as students, and he was sort of scolding us for paying too much attention to racial epithets and to George Wallace and the use of the N-word and things like that. And he kept saying, you ought to pay attention to the infant mortality rates in the hospital. You ought to pay attention to the unemployment rates. You ought to pay attention to discrimination in the military and places like that. That if we were going to change society, you got to focus on structural and systemic racism in dominant institutions and the kinds of costs and resources that it would take to dismantle that. And it was the first time that I actually heard of the concept institutional racism. I think we're still there. I think often on campus, someone sends a letter, or there's a sign, or there's some kind of a name calling, and then students mobilize. They want the chancellor or the president to make a statement against it. But that doesn't even touch the kind of structural racism or institutional racism that remains intact until we focus on what resources are necessary. Now, on the COVID-19 pandemic, what resources are necessary so that Native Americans don't bear a disproportionate and adverse costs of this pandemic. The Latinx communities that are being hurt terribly by this pandemic, in terms of employment, particularly the employment of Latinx women. How do we prevent this sort of thing from destroying communities? Well, it takes resources. It takes universal health care. It takes a Congress bill that looks at small business and unemployment and sustaining the welfare of people who are adversely affected by this. You cannot attack institutional and structural racism without facing the enormous question of the kinds of costs that it will take to dismantle it.
Yes, yeah, that's it. And Professor Span, you're on your phone there. If you got you're also a historian with a long view of these things. What's your view, and what's something you'd like to put to Professor Anderson as well?
Well, first and foremost, I do appreciate the establishing this conversation and for me being a part of this conversation. I deeply appreciate Professor Anderson's offering concrete examples of what an individual form of racism is, such as the people calling someone the N-word or a name, or someone who would harm a person simply because of the color of their skin or their race, and also the forms of institutional racism, which are entire institutions. It could be hospitals and schools and banks with loan officers who go about denying people because of their racial or ethnic background opportunities, or offering people opportunities because of their racial background in this sense. I would want to see if he could extend it just a little bit further to help anyone listening to this understand how it's not just individual institutional, but also systemic. And so thinking about concrete examples of systemic racism, but tying it to something that I think is fundamental to all of this, which is of the gaps that he was talking about, the economic gaps, the wealth gaps, education gaps. There's a real racial value gap in the United States. And it stems as far back as the introduction of the first Africans to arrive in colonial Virginia in 1619, so 400 plus years ago. But I was hoping he could speak to how this racial value gap throughout history has morphed into what we have today. And then speak a little bit more as he's discussing what systemic racism is, strategies for people to think about how we go about closing the racial value gap. So one essay that I've recently written juxtaposes two ships. The Mayflower, we're in the 400th anniversary of the arrival of the Mayflower that brought pilgrims to colonial Massachusetts. And that came in 1620, but a year earlier in 1619, the first 20 Africans would arrive in colonial Virginia. And they would arrive on a ship that I would argue that no one in America would know except a dedicated historians who studies of specifics of this history. The name of that ship is the White Lion, Lion. It's a pirate ship that brought those Africans after they stole them off a slaver ship called the Sao Joao Batista. So I was wondering if Anderson could speak to, again, that racial value gap that has morphed over these 4 centuries, ways that we can go about closing it going forward, and speak of it in a way that also provides concrete examples for listeners to understand not just the individual institutional forms of racism that he talked about, but systemic racism as well.
I think any system of oppression, whether slavery or settler colonialism, carries with it a kind of bias that becomes almost unconscious in the way that people look at those who are the subjects and who are victims, and even the way they speak about them. There was a recent example in Mississippi where the person in charge of voter registration was alarmed by the rapid increase in the number of African Americans that were registered to vote. And she sent out an alarm. She says, the blacks are registering to vote at an alarming rate. And then she said, it's time for the people to get involved. Mm-hmm. And she counterpose blacks against people without even thinking. You know? And it's the sort of thing that police do when they arrest someone or they apprehend someone like George Floyd. It's that they code switch. And instead of thinking of them as people or as human beings, they become the blacks. Even the president has a phrase where he's a friend to the blacks. And the blacks become this sort of thing that is other than people. And the way you respond to them, the way you treat them, the way you think about them has really been baked into your unconscious in a way. Now, when you talk to people about things like this, they would often say, well, I didn't intend to insult anyone. I didn't intend to hurt anyone. But without even realizing it, we've developed a kind of system of values in which actually the phrase Black Lives Matter speaks to that. Some people don't like it. They say all lives matter. But what they're saying is that historically, we have been divided in such a way that we have to assert boldly that our lives matter. And we have to keep saying it until everyone comes to say, yes, your life matters as much as any other human lives. And that the sanctity of African-American life is on a plane of equality with other people. But that's not something that's going to happen overnight. It's going to take a constant and persistent education as well as protests against anything to the contrary. But there's so many times when you listen to something and you realize, they're not thinking of you as a human being. And in the article that we wrote together, I tried to remind people that Mark Twain understood this in 1884 when he published Huckleberry Finn. He's making up a story for his grandmother, or his aunt actually, and it's a story because he's late, and he has made up a story about how he's late because of there was an accident on a steamboat. And though she believes him, and she says to him, I hope no one got hurt. And he said, nobody got hurt, but using the N-word got killed. So it's like nobody got hurt, meaning the human beings didn't get hurt, but a black person was killed, as if that death is an afterthought. And so we have to constantly remind in education, in public, in discourse, in politics, and other places, in business and employment, that you have to think of human beings, whether they're Native Americans, whether they're Latinx, Asian Americans, as a quality of humanity as to be expressed. And we're seeing this across the board. We're seeing this with the rise of anti-Asian racism that's being documented. The notion that somehow the flu is Kung flu or Chinese flu. We use these phrases, we use these terms to centralize our biases and to map them onto the bodies of a minoritized population. So there is work to be done to erase this kind of unconscious devaluing of people based upon their phenotypic traits.
Okay, so I think you were going to, Mary was going to ask.
I have a question too, Jim.
Yes.
I think with scholars like you and scholars before you, so much has been written and unearthed and continues about these issues, right? It's not that there isn't an abundance of information available, but it seems that, it's selectively engaged with, even when it's in classrooms, people switch off or switch on. But some years ago, Jim, we were talking rather perhaps naively or optimistically that the demographic shifts in this nation could lead to what we were then kind of fancifully calling a new America that was prosperous, creative, just and inclusive. So I kind of want to ask you, was that naive to imagine that that was possible? Were we wrong to think that demographic changes were enough in themselves? What happens with all these demographic shifts over many decades now? Have they or have they not led to a just and inclusive society? Is demography part of the solution? It's certainly have been part of the fear and the backlash. So I was wondering what your thoughts were now as we're rethinking these issues in everyday life for everyone in this country.
Thanks for the question. Excellent question. I see it's two sides of the same coin. I've always held that demography is not destiny, because there's so many political and economic changes that can offset what seems to be a kind of destined outcome of demography. The other thing that I've always understood about it is that as a historian, those changes are gradual and imperceptible. And so we wake up one day, and I'll give examples. For instance, when I graduated from college, 75% of all bachelor's degrees went to male. And if you put it in a spectrum, you'd be hard put to say where along the spectrum did the majority of degrees go to females. There was nobody saying, oh, it's going to happen here, it's going to happen there. You wake up one day, and that's the world we live in. There are universities like 56, 60% majority female, and most of the BAs now, the majority go to female. Demography, I think, is going to work the same way. You look at a place like Texas that used to be a kind of one-party state. It's not that anymore. You have to struggle now, and you can see that the impact of the changes is due in large part to the growth of the Latinx population in that state. The same is true for Arizona and New Mexico and places like that. And we're seeing this in elected officials. You look around and say demography has made a difference. The mayor of Washington, D.C., the mayor of Chicago, the mayor of Atlanta, the governor of New Mexico, the mayor of Houston. You're seeing that these demographic changes are not only just statistics, they represent people with different interests, people with different values, people with different needs, and eventually they come to realize what those needs are, what those values are, and they ask for a different kind of society. It doesn't happen overnight, but I think we are on the precipice of seeing how those demographic changes over the last several decades, particularly since 1968, when we changed the immigration laws and made them, to the extent that we could, non-racist. The largest group of immigrants coming into the U.S. now are Asian. Most people think they are Latinx from Mexico. These demographic changes give us different populations with different backgrounds, and they also give us a certain kind of people who are comfortable living with diversity and living in multi-ethnic and multiracial communities. That, in the long run, I think, is going to make a difference in American politics. We cannot continue as a nation where we have, we base our government on the consent of a very small or unrepresentative sample or segment of the population. I think these voices are going to matter in the long run. Now, how they matter, we shouldn't treat them as a monolith, for instance. If we look at, say, for example, the Latinx vote, it's not a monolith. There are people who vote in a way because they're Catholic. There are people who vote because of their attitudes on abortion or birth control, things like that. It is going to be diversity within groups. But at the same time, I think the overall impact is going to call for a very different kind of America.
Okay, so what we'll do, just to close this off now, we'll go back, maybe we'll back out the way we came. We'll get Professor Span, then Professor Pak, and then Professor Trent to give a final word, and then our very last word to Professor Anderson. So, Chris, let's some ideas that might have been sparked from the conversation so far. And
well, first and foremost, I love the way this conversation has flowed around, helping everyday people understand their potential to impact change and to be allies for I think the most important thing that we can continue to do is to help people realize that everyday people change America. They request through their ideas and public sentiment the policies and laws that are going to dictate society. Anderson raised an excellent point about the fact that we've never really written, and if we've written it, we've never really taught and distributed the anti-racist history that has existed alongside the examples in history of racism in the United States. Like, we don't really know the names of the people, the policies and laws they developed that democratized America. And we might know of individuals like Dr. King and Rosa Parks. But again, I don't know if many people know who Charles Sumner is. Like, we unfortunately know more about Robert E. Lee, who fought in a treasonous way against the United States, than we do about Ulysses S. Grant, who fought to save the Union and became the President of the United States that led Reconstruction in America, an America without slavery, after the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. So we have to go through the process of rewriting, in some ways, history, not to erase moments of the past, but to offer clarification as to truly what it was, and also to offer a history that is reflective of individuals that transformed our society for the better. I think the same thing happens with everyday opportunities too. Like, we think about our teachers, they have to understand the uniform that they wear and the authority that they have and the history that comes with that. If we think about our police, they have to understand the uniform that they wear, and that every time they stop someone, whether it's 1 o'clock in the afternoon or 1 o'clock in the morning, if it's an African American or a person of color in a car, we're wearing an unfortunate history of what it means to be that person of color in America and all the misperceptions that go with it. But they too are wearing a uniform that has a long history and misperceptions and systemic forms of racism that are tied to it. So we have to have those engaged conversations to understand our positionality, to better understand our collective humanity going forward. So I appreciate this conversation. And I think if I had a chance to ask Anderson one more question, again, how do you help people, like if you were at a police training institute and you got all these very and how their whole process is to de-escalate that history so it turns it into a new history, lay a new foundation. If you got candidates in a teacher education program, how do you help them de-escalate, the way they have come to think about difference, as you were describing, and getting them to understand that it's so important to recognize that history, not that it persuades you to just live it in the past, but it guides you to understanding the present and the future. So I think just a couple concrete examples from there, if Anderson has time, I would greatly appreciate it. But I also just appreciate the conversation and direction that has gone, because I look forward to anyone listening to this hopefully taking and making meaning of it and using it as a guide in the direction they want to go in the future.
We might hold those to Professor Anderson's closing thoughts. Professor Pak, next. Would you like to sort of try and tie a bit this together and prompt Jim towards some closing thoughts?
Certainly. And I come back to more questions. I think that's the other important thing for our audience here, is that we have had the privilege of being able to think and read and study so many of these subjects, but it doesn't mean that we don't continue to learn and to ask questions and be really flummoxed at the situation that's in front of us. The one thing that I come away with continually is asking, why is it so difficult for us to see each other as human beings? I mean, the fight for equality in our history, the anti-racist history that Professor Anderson has pointed to, the whole history of parental agency in terms of fight for equal schooling for their kids, it's because communities, African American communities, have valued education at the risk of their lives. Why is that so hard to believe now, when we've continued to pathologize groups of people as not valuing education, but at the same time holding other groups up, like Asians, as to say they value education? The ways in which the groups are pitted against each other serves none of us. That's the other thing that we need to also continue to educate ourselves on. But as we move through these moments, to be serious about the ways in which systemic racism is a public health crisis. This is nothing new in the ways that it's been perceived in terms of race as a form of disease. Racism is a form of disease that needs to be inoculated. It was also pronounced in the early 20th century, but now in this day and age, how do we seriously take that as a moment for all of us to consider and ponder, because it seeps into the everyday of access to schooling, access to public health systems, but in a way that has demoted and the full capacity of humanity. And that, to me, well, I hope I don't ask these types of questions in the near future. But hopefully that there's ways that we can address this with the younger generation as well.
And Professor Trent.
Well, first I want to underscore Jim's examples of the difficulty and the length of time consideration with regard to achieving the kinds of changes that we thought we were going to see, Mary, with the demographic changes. Sociologists have multiple definitions of this concept of institutionalized practices. They are an agreed upon set of solutions to particular things constructed as problems. So segregation is one of those. So we have redlining, we have restrictions that are written into the legal codes about who can purchase certain property. I've bought properties that said no Negroes can buy this. So we still have evidence of those documents in existence. So we have this set of practices, solutions to some extent everyday problems that we have over the past 450 years taught to each successive generation, each successive cohort. These become internalized responses and reactions to resolving these issues. To rid ourselves of those institutionalized practices that are deeply embedded in our churches, in our schools, in our literature, it's a sustained effort that has to be made in order to first identify what those are, secondly, to demonstrate the kind of damage and harm they do, and begin this process of extricating ourselves from reliance on those solutions. One of those issues that I think has really come to the forefront here, and Jim can help me on this a lot, help all of us on this a lot, and that is this issue of citizenship. Who is entitled to it? Who can be the beneficiaries of citizenship in America? And since Trump came down the escalator, he has been hell-bent on denying citizenship to any number of people, in addition to those of us who have had to consistently contest for having our rights as citizens, as human citizens, acknowledged, supported, and adhered to. That's a lengthy process of getting people to develop alternative ways of resolving these things we think of as problems. So, Jim, I think you're spot on with regard to helping people understand the power of these institutionalized practices, the extent to which we don't even have to think about it. We do it kind of automatically. We walk away from places that are too something. You provide the word, too feminine, too many women, too many Asians. Kids drop out of classes at our university, white kids, because there are too many Asian kids in the classroom. And there are a whole set of explanations that they draw down from somewhere that justifies their making that decision to them. So we have this struggle that we have to consistently be engaged in. And that's why the teaching of a different history, a real history and providing the examples makes so much of a difference.
Okay, over to you then, Jim, for the last
I was
word.
going to say something. Sorry.
Go ahead. Mary, you were going to say something?
Yes, I wanted to say something too, Jim, and ask you a question also. I mean, we've been talking about our common humanity, and we've been talking about all the systemic issues that undermine that common humanity. And I just wanted to ask about that because you and I have had this conversation before. It seems that we, as Dr. Trent just said, we live in a kind of apartheid in our everyday lives, in our personal lives, you know, our everyday lives. I mean, I just heard recently somebody say in the media, racism is rampant, right? But now it's videoed. We can actually see it. And we've seen people who've done racist things who say, I'm not a racist. Well, what they mean is, in my everyday life, when I don't come into contact with anybody, I'm not a racist. I'm only a racist when I come into contact with somebody, which goes to this thing about, you know, the culture or the consciousness or the unconscious bias. How do we address that reality? You know, how it's because it's people who make the decisions, people who live in the systems, people who, and hearts and minds, I think, as we've all kind of noted in this country, have for many years not seen common humanity sufficiently in order to produce that inclusive, decent life that everybody thinks they should have from the moment they're born.
I think you make a good point. It's that kind of insulation, kind of apartheid that we live in, where we see the world, we see things in terms of how they affect us, but not in a broader humanity. And I was very, I use it a lot. I was very much taken by the poem that Maya Angelou, the late Maya Angelou, did at Obama's inauguration. And there was a line in which he said, history, despite its wrenching pain, can never be unlived. But if faced with courage, need never be lived again. Mm-hmm. She understood how difficult it was going to be to accept Obama. And she also understood that accepting him meant that we had to face our past squarely. And that is such a huge challenge, such a steep climb for most human beings. For instance, we recognize genocide in Germany. We recognize the genocide against the Armenians. We've asked our Congress to recognize the genocide against Native Americans. That's where they freeze. That's where they're unable to face their past squarely. You can't get our Congress to apologize for American slavery. Now you take the same people and you ask them about the Nanjing massacre, the creation of competent women by the Japanese in Korea. You ask them about apartheid in South Africa. They can then discuss those things as forms of oppression, but they cannot face their own past squarely. So the big challenge in any society, and it's not just this society, South Africa had a reconciliation committee that failed because people could not face the past of apartheid. And so you're right, the consciousness has to come to what Maya Angelou said, and it has to come from this recognition that there's hope in the idea that what is past cannot be unlived, but if faced with courage, it need never be lived again. And I think that's something that we have to teach, we have to stress, and we have to talk to people about, and fans raise the issue of police. It's hard for any group to look at its own past in the way that Maya Angelou asks us to do. We can look at other parts of the world and discuss the same things rationally with a sense of humanity and decency and turn it back. I mean, one of the things that came up with the trip to, the president's trip to South Dakota, the Black Hills are the sacred land of the Okalala Sioux, Mahasapa. The Supreme Court ruled in 1980 that it belongs to them, but no president, not even Obama, has said, through executive order, let's return this land to the Native Americans. Because to do so, I mean, we have to really face a past that we don't like, a past that's ugly, a past that's been genocidal, and a past in which where we have just mistreated and oppressed the indigenous population of this country. But our only way out of all of this is the way that Maya Angelou told us. We have to face our past squarely so it never be lived again.
Well, that's a wonderful way to end this conversation, and I want to thank everybody for being part of it. I also want to thank the tens of thousands of people who've enrolled in the MOOC, which Jim created several years back, and I think what we've done today with this recording is we've honoured the spirit of that MOOC, and hopefully we've honoured the intent of all the people who've taken the MOOC, and this recording will make available to everybody who's taken it. So thank you very much to our group. It's wonderful to work in a college where we have such fantastic colleagues who are able to think so clearly about these very, very important issues.